Recording started.
Hi there, sc24 students. We're going to have a recording here that's going to go over material from the health unit. And so in this situation, we're just doing a recording that I'll be sending out to you guys. So please go over this recording. And there'll be certain situations where I'll be asking you a question and then giving you a few minutes to think about it, and then we'll go over the questions. And again, remember to go over the PDF file that I sent as well, and make sure that you can do all the questions on the PDF file. So our test will be next Wednesday, May 26th, and I wish you guys the best on it. Also want to remind you to be keeping up in your assignments and preparing for the final exams as well, because finals are coming really quickly, actually just in a few weeks, and so for that reason it's important to keep up with your tests, get them in on time, and your assignments as well. So hope you guys are having a great time. I don't know about you, but the weather here in Edmonton is just fantastic. Well, some of the time anyways, but better than the snow we had a few weeks ago. So I've just been enjoying the time, you know, when I go out and play soccer with the kids and stuff like that. So hope you guys are enjoying it as well. Okay, so we're going to jump into this then. There are two different main types of diseases that we look at, and so we're just going to highlight those right now. Those are communicable diseases and non-communicable diseases. So first of all, we're going to focus on the left-hand side of the screen, and then we'll focus on the right-hand side. So if you just want to kind of ignore the right-hand side for now. Now, a communicable disease, like the name implies, if you think about the word communicate, it's you know, talking between two people, and so communicable disease is one that you can catch from another person. So it kind of makes sense based on the word communicate. And so an example of a communicable disease would be a cold. I'm sure you guys have all had those. Everyone in my family's had one recently, except for me. Touch wood. And so when we look at a communicable disease, we catch them from other people because we get them from germs or bugs. So we're just kind of thinking of germs and bugs in general, but let's look at a little more specifically what kind of germs and bugs we're talking about. Okay, so there's 4 different types of bugs, if you want to call them that can transmit disease from one person to another. Then there's bacteria and viruses. Those are the most common type that we normally think of. There's also parasites and fungi. Okay, so we'll look at those in a little more detail in the next page. Before we do that, let's look at non-communicable diseases. And so non-communicable diseases are ones that cannot be caught from another person. So some examples of those are cancer or depression. And again, those are things that we could possibly inherit them from someone. You know, there might be a bit of a tendency that way, but we don't catch them from someone else during our lifetime. Okay, so those again are non-communicable diseases. There's 3 different main ways that you can get a non-communicable disease. One is your lifestyle, so that's the way you live. You know, for instance, your health, your exercise, that sort of thing. The environment. Okay, so that could be, you know, different things like smoke in the environment or something like that, or whatever. Genetics, that would be the tendencies that you inherit from your parents, or the different traits that you inherit from your parents, right? That's what we're talking about with genetics. Okay, so let's go on to the next page. So let's look at 4 different examples of bugs that we looked at and some of the diseases that they cause. Okay, so we're going to be going from A to B, C to D here. So first of all, we're looking at an example of a bacteria. This one's actually got a tail on it. And so it's kind of a tail, you could say. It's called a flagellum, but it actually acts like a little bit of a motor. But anyways, really cool to look at. So this bacteria here is called E. coli bacteria. It's one of the most common types of bacteria. And it's really important to cook your hamburgers well, you know, just so you don't see any pink in them. And that way you can avoid getting something like flesh-eating disease, which is caused by E. coli bacteria. Okay, now on to viruses. And in this picture here we see a heart. And the reason why we've got a picture of a heart here is that viruses can infect the heart, and that causes a condition called myocarditis. Okay, so again, myocarditis is a condition caused by a virus. And on to parasites now. Parasites, you can think of them as almost like tiny, tiny little bugs. They're actually larger for the most part than bacteria or viruses. But an example is Giardia. So this guy right here is called Giardia. It almost looks like he's got a little face on him. He doesn't actually, but it almost looks that way. But he's a parasite that lives in the intestines, and because he lives in your intestines, and that's where your nutrients go through, he uses up your nutrients. So this little guy would cause an intestinal infection. Okay, so you'd have a sore, well, it would feel like a sore stomach, but he's actually in your intestines. Okay, now this situation here is caused by a fungus. You might have had this before. It's called athlete's foot. I've had this before. The reason you get this is often you've been playing a lot of sports, you get a lot of sweat accumulating on your feet, and then because of that you can see that you get scabs forming. Just a little funny story about this that kind of puts together two of the different diseases we talked about before. There was one time that I had something like this appear on my feet, and it just appeared really suddenly, and my wife was a little bit concerned about it and said, you should probably go to the emergency. Well, I did end up going to the emergency because she encouraged me to, but after sitting there for a few hours, it turns out it wasn't anything serious. Like, we were kind of thinking, oh, could this be, flesh-eating disease? It just turned out to be athlete's foot. So, anyways, I don't know if you guys have ever had something like that happen before, but once in a while you have a bit of a surprise when you go to the emergency like that. Okay, on to the next one. So what we're going to do at this point is we're going to review some review questions. I'm going to go over the questions and I'll read them and just give you a bit of time to think about them, and then on the next page I'll give you the answers. So the first question, what are the two main kinds of diseases? Okay, we'll go on to the next one. Excuse me. What are the four main types of bugs that can transmit communicable diseases? Four main types of bugs. And the third question we have here, for each of the four types of bugs, list an example of one of those bugs or a disease caused by this bug, or both. Okay, now we'll go on to the answers. Okay, so what are the two main types of diseases? Communicable diseases and non-communicable diseases. What are the four main types of bugs that can transmit communicable diseases? Well, we've got bacteria and viruses, and then we've also got parasites and fungus, or fungi. Now, for each of the four types of bugs, list an example of one of these bugs or a disease caused by this bug, or both. So when we did this, when we covered this area, we either went over one of them or the other, or sometimes we went over both. So with bacteria, we looked at E. coli and we saw that it causes flesh-eating disease. For viruses, we looked at an example of an infection which was myocarditis, which was a heart infection. Now for parasites, we saw this little guy called Giardia, which produces an intestinal infection. And for a fungus, an example of a disease caused by a fungus, we saw that athlete's foot was an example. If you remember old Mr. K in the emergency room, you'll remember athlete's foot. Okay, on to the next stuff. Let's look at examples of each of the sources of non-communicable diseases. Okay, so let's look at lifestyle diseases, what cause them, environmental diseases, what cause those, and what cause genetic diseases. Okay. Or rather, we'll also be looking at examples of each one. Okay, so for an example of a lifestyle disease, AIDS would be an example of this disease because it's generally associated with a person's lifestyle. This is because it is usually, though not always, transmitted through sex. Okay, so for the next one, an example of a disease that's associated with the environment, lung cancer is a disease that occurs because of our environment. So what is it in the environment that's causing lung disease? Well, of course it's smoke from a cigarette, and this could either be from smoking directly or from secondhand smoke. And here's a comparison of a normal lung to a person's lung with lung cancer, and you can see that it's looking a lot worse. Okay, so an example of a disease that falls under genetics is cystic fibrosis. This is a disease, so again, we can inherit this from our parents. That's why it's falling under genetics. And with this disease, there is scarring or fibrosis in the pancreas, and one of the main symptoms is difficulty in breathing. All right. On to the next page. Okay, a closer look at microorganisms. Now, we also call microorganisms microbes. And here we can see someone looking under a microscope. There were two scientists, Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur, who were the first to identify the tiny creatures such as bacteria and viruses. And because they're tiny, we call them microorganisms or microbes. So we know that microbes cause certain communicable diseases. And you might have heard your mom say before, you know, wash your hands, wash your hands. Well, there's actually good reason for that, because it prevents a lot of diseases. And it's actually probably the number one thing that people can do to prevent diseases is to wash their hands, especially in the food industry. So one of the diseases that you can prevent is, it's called a staph infection, and it comes from staph bacteria, which are called staphylococcus bacteria, but we all often call them just staph bacteria. Okay, so if you wash your hands before touching your food, you can prevent staph bacteria from causing staph infections. Okay, now there's two types of food poisoning that people can often get. One of them is called botulism, and the other is called salmonellosis. A little hard to say there, salmonellosis. Okay, so botulism, sometimes if you're in the grocery store and you see a can that's got a bulge in it, you want to avoid that can because there's a possibility it's got botulism bacteria growing in it. Botulism bacteria don't like oxygen, so when they're sealed in a can, they could grow to large numbers, and that could produce the pressure that's pushing out the can. So if you ever see a bulge, you want to avoid that can. And an interesting thing about salmonellosis, if I can say it, is it can actually be caused by things like turtles. So if you have a turtle for a pet, you have to be very careful and wash your hands so you don't get this disease. Okay, so that, again, those are two types of food poisoning that people can get. Okay, so let's look at some questions just to review the last material that we went over. First question, name 3 sources that can cause non-communicable diseases. Okay. Now, what's an example of each one of these sources? Or I think actually what this question should be asking is, what's an example of each one of the non-communicable diseases? That's another way of saying it. Okay. And the next question, give another name for microorganisms. And the last question says, state the name of the bacteria which can lead to a disease when unwashed hands come in contact with food. Oh, one more. Give 2 different examples of food poisoning. Okay, let's check out the answers for these. So name 3 sources that can cause non-communicable diseases. Lifestyle, so the way we live. Our environment, so different things in our environment like smoke or whatever. Genetics, okay, so getting them from our parents. Give an example of each source listed above. I think this should actually say give an example of each one of these types of diseases, but these are the sources. So if lifestyle is a source of one of the non-communicable diseases, what's an example of a lifestyle disease? Well, that would be AIDS. An example of a disease you get from the environment is lung cancer, and a disease associated with genetics is cystic fibrosis. Okay, the next question, give another name for microorganism, a microbe, and state the name of the bacteria which can lead to a disease when unwashed hands come in contact with food. That's a staphylococcus, that would be the bacteria, and we often call it a staph infection. Okay, give 2 examples of food poisoning. Botulism, that was the one with the bulgy can, and salmonellosis. There we go. Okay, I'll get it. Okay, we're going to talk, guys, about genetics and immunity at this point. So heredity is the study of inherited traits. So for example, we know that blue eyes can be passed down from a mom to her daughter. Genetics is a science that looks at how DNA or genes play a part in passing traits from parents to their kids. Now, as this picture shows, because of heredity, children often closely resemble their parents. We know that. Okay, now DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, very, very important chemical. It's a special chemical found in most cells in our body, almost every cell. DNA is like a tiny computer program. It tells what traits our body is going to have. Remember that a gene is a section of DNA that tells the body to produce a certain trait. So when we're talking about traits, that could be a gene that makes us tall or possibly gives us brown hair. Now, DNA is a special structure in the body known as a chromosome. Okay, so what I was trying to say here is when DNA is formed into a certain structure, then it's known as a chromosome. Okay, so when it's wound around like a coil, then we call DNA a chromosome. That's what I was trying to say there. Okay, on to the next page. So here we can see what DNA looks like. We think of DNA as being like a spiral-shaped ladder, and but when it's really wound up, then it forms these X-shaped structures, and those are called chromosomes. So again, a chromosome is just a special structure of DNA. Now, most of the time when our bodies are doing cell division, DNA it has to be duplicated in order for our cells to divide. And most of the time this takes place without any problems at all. But sometimes there's problems when cells are dividing, and these are called genetic disorders. Okay, so a genetic disorder is a disorder that has to do with the usually the division of cells or division of DNA. And usually when two new cells are being produced, that's the point. When the DNA is separating into two new cells, that's usually the point where genetic disorders develop. Okay, an example that is quite common in our world of a genetic disorder is something known as trisomy 21, and this is called Down syndrome. All right, now mutations are specific problems that occur within DNA. So we looked at earlier how DNA is like a ladder, and the rungs of the ladder are what we call bases, and sometimes those bases don't copy properly, and that's what can cause a problem within DNA. Okay, so DNA again, or a mutation again, is a problem within DNA, the structure. Amniocentesis, what is that? Well, that's a test that's done during pregnancy that can test for a genetic disorder. So what happens is a small amount of fluid is removed from the amniotic sac that's around the baby. Now, the best purpose of this test is to help a family prepare a home for a baby who's going to have a genetic disorder. Okay, so if you know you're going to have a kid who's going to have Down syndrome or something like that, maybe you know that they're going to have certain needs or something like that that you need to take care of. So that would be the best purpose of this test. Okay, what we're looking at here is we're looking at an example of a mutation. So I was saying before that the rungs of the ladder on a DNA molecule are what we call bases. And if you have a mutation occur, the rungs don't actually meet together properly. Okay, so that's what happens in a mutation. Now, what kind of things cause a mutation? Well, if DNA was exposed to ultraviolet light or UV light, that could cause a mutation. And so, of course, that's one of the reasons why there's concern nowadays for how much light we're getting, whether we're getting too much light from the sun, because that can cause the DNA in your molecules, or rather in your cells, I should say, to mutate. X-rays are another cause of mutations, so we have to be careful we're not getting too many X-rays. But any kind of substance that causes a mutation like UV light or X-rays is called a mutagen. All right, now what's an example of a disease that can result from a mutation? Well, something called sickle cell anemia. And what happens is normally hemoglobin is a substance in our blood that carries oxygen. But what happens is the hemoglobin molecule is changed when there's a mutation, and so because of that, it's not able to carry oxygen as well. So that's the problem with sickle cell anemia. Okay, let's look over a few questions here again. What's the name for the study of inherited traits? And what substances play a role in genetics, and what role do they play? What is the purpose of DNA, and how do genes relate to DNA? How do DNA and chromosomes relate? And what's the name of the disease caused by a problem in someone's genes? And what is a mutation? What's the name of the test that's done during pregnancy to determine if a baby has a genetic disease? What is a mutagen, and name 2 examples of them? And how does sickle cell anemia relate to mutations? Okay, let's check out the answers here. So what's the name for the study of inherited traits? Heredity. And you can see that the word heredity is kind of close to inherited traits. Okay, next question. What substances play a role in genetics, and what role do they play? Okay, DNA is like a tiny computer program that determines our traits. For example, our eye color. What's the purpose of DNA, and how do genes relate to DNA? Well, sections of DNA called genes determine our traits. Okay, and what's the relationship again between DNA and chromosomes? Well, one piece of DNA coiled around and around forms a structure called a chromosome. What's the name of a disease caused by a problem in someone's genes? That's a genetic disorder. What's a mutation? That's a problem with DNA, often in the division of DNA. What's the name of the test done during pregnancy to determine if a baby has a genetic disease? Amniocentesis. What is a mutagen, and name 2 examples of them? Okay, it's a chemical that causes a mutation, and X-rays and UV light are examples of mutagens. How does sickle cell anemia relate to mutations? Well, mutations in the genes that program for the substance called hemoglobin change the shape of this molecule, so because of that, it's not able to carry oxygen as well. All right. So, this section here we're looking at is the body's defense system, so you can kind of get that idea from this diagram here. The body has 2 main types of defense systems, the physical defense system and the immune defense system. So we're going to look at the physical defense system in a little bit more detail. But first of all, another name for the immune defense system is the inflammatory response. Or at least an inflammatory response takes place when we have our immune system being set off. So basically, the inflammatory response occurs when a lot of blood is sent to an area. So if something's inflamed in your body, there's going to be a lot of blood in that area. There's going to be swelling. There's going to be warmth. You know, so if your arm has been injured and there's inflammation there, you're going to be able to touch it and feel warmth. There's going to be redness in that area and possibly pain as well. Okay, so our body's defense system is our body's first line of defense, and the goal of this system is to prevent harmful substances from entering our bodies in the first place. So if you can prevent them from getting in the first place, that's great, because then you don't have to deal with them any further. So what are some examples of physical defenses? Well, our skin, that's one of the main things. It acts as a barrier to things getting in. Also, acids in the stomach will kill bacteria that are in there, or acids that are in our sweat will kill bacteria on our skin. Okay, so now let's look a little bit more into immune defense, or the immune system. The immune system is another name for immune defense. The main types of substances involved in the immune system are antibodies. And just like their name suggests, you know, something that's anti-something is against something. And so antibodies act against something. They act against these substances called antigens. Those are foreign substances that enter the body, and we want to get rid of them. Okay, so antibodies and antigens are going to react with each other. Now, how exactly does the body respond to antigens? All right, so here's an example of an antigen, and what's going to happen to it? Well, if we look at the different steps involved here, we see that the first step is bacteria enters the body and an inflammatory response occurs. The first thing that's going to happen is these special cells called macrophages surround and destroy some of the bacteria. Okay, so that's going to be the job of these macrophages. You can see they kind of surround this bacteria. The next thing that's going to happen is the antigens that are from the dead bacteria. Okay, so the antigen is kind of like one part of the bacteria. Those are going to stick out from the macrophages that engulf the bacteria. Okay, so those antigens are sticking out. Now what happens in the next step is white blood cells called helper T cells are going to identify the antigens that are on the macrophages, and then those white blood cells, special white blood cells called B cells are going to make and release antibodies. And what are those antibodies going to do? The antibodies produced by the B cells are going to attach to the antigens on the invader, making it easier to destroy. They're kind of labeling it, you could say. Okay, and the last thing is those B cells are going to produce memory cells that store information about the antigen. Okay, because your body wants to remember this invader, so the next time it's already prepared because it's already produced those antibodies. So it's already ready to fight that disease, that same bacteria, if it comes into the body again. Okay, so again, those are the steps that are the body's response to antigens. Now we're going to look at two different types of immunity: inherited immunity and acquired immunity. Okay, so again, when your body has the ability to resist something long-term, something like a bacteria on a long-term basis, that's called immunity. Inherited immunity is when we inherit immunity to most diseases and plants. For example, the pathogens that cause runny eyes in cats do not cause runny eyes in humans. We're just born with immunity to those kind of pathogens. Acquired immunity, we're going to focus mainly on them. There's two types of acquired immunity. There's active immunity and there's passive. Okay, so like the name suggests, something that's active is something that does something, right? So in active immunity, the body produces its own antibodies to defend against a specific antigen. Whereas passive immunity, we're not able to produce our own antibodies. We need to be given those antibodies. So for instance, if we're vaccinated, that would be an example of passive immunity. Okay, so with active immunity, it takes several weeks before we can provide protection. So our body needs to provide these or produce these antibodies over a number of weeks. All right, so with passive immunity, it only lasts for a short time. Whereas when we build up our own antibodies, like with active immunity, we're going to have those antibodies in our body for a long period of time. So passive immunity, it only lasts for a short time because the body destroys the borrowed antibodies. Passive immunity provides immediate protection. All right, so we looked at how passive immunity is when we're given antibodies, we're not producing them ourselves, and that occurs during vaccination. What a vaccine actually is you're actually given part of the bacteria that causes a disease. So you're given a dead bacteria, so that way it's not actually harmful to you. And once that bacteria or part of the bacteria is injected into the body, it triggers the body to produce antibodies against the antigens in the vaccine. So again, as we looked at earlier, when you've done something like this, an individual has a lasting protection against a specific disease. So when you're vaccinated against a disease, you're going to continue to have that resistance to that disease. All right, so you guys are probably quite familiar with the swine flu and getting a vaccination to the swine flu. So here's an example of a girl getting a vaccination. Maybe it's for the swine flu. Okay, let's look at a few questions then, reviewing what we've just gone over. What are the two main types of defense in the body? And what are physical defenses? What exactly do they do? I'll give two different examples of physical defenses. What substances are involved in immune defense? And what is their job? What is an antigen? And what are macrophages? And what is their role? Remember, we looked at these different steps the body takes to defend against antigens. What exactly did the macrophages do to the antigens? Well, what is the difference between active and passive immunity? Think about what the word active means. And what takes place during a vaccination? Okay, let's look at the answers. Two main types of defense in the body: physical defense and immune defense. So what are some examples of physical defenses? Skin, sweat, and acid, for instance in the stomach. But what substances are involved in immune defense and what is their job? Okay, well the main substances are antibodies, and their job is to attach to antigens and trigger an immune response. What is an antigen? That's a foreign substance that an antibody joins to and triggers an immune response. So a foreign substance that's part of a bacteria, for instance. What are macrophages and what is their role? Remember, from the picture we looked at earlier, they surround the bacteria, or whatever it is, and they destroy some of the bacteria which enter. What's the difference between active and passive immunity? Well, active immunity, it's active because the body's producing its own antibodies, and with passive immunity, we're given antibodies, such as from an injection. Okay, that leads us to what takes place during a vaccination. Well, part of a dead pathogen, for instance a dead bacteria, is injected into a person, and this causes the person to produce antibodies against the disease. So in other words, long-term immunity. Okay, awesome. Now, this picture here is showing us some pills, so we're going to be looking at some different types of medication. The main two types we're going to look at are antibiotics and over-the-counter medication. So what is the difference between the two? Well, with antibiotics, those are drugs that need to be prescribed by a doctor. Whereas with over-the-counter medications, we can just pick them up off the shelf. Okay, so what do antibiotics do? Well, if you think about the word antibiotic, biotic means living, right? The study of biology is the study of living things. Anti means against, right? So antibiotics act against certain living things. So they actually control the growth of bacteria and sometimes things like fungi. But they're actually caused, or I should say they're actually produced, antibiotics are actually produced by other types of microorganisms. So for instance, when the first type of antibiotic was discovered, it was bread mold. Okay, so somebody discovered that bread mold was able to act against bacteria. So antibiotics are produced by one form of microorganism, and that's a bread mold. That's a living thing, a bread mold. And they control another type of microorganism, such as a bacteria. Okay, so again, penicillin is one of the most common types of antibiotic, and it's produced from bread mold. So again, on the other hand, over-the-counter medications such as cough drops do not need to be prescribed by a doctor. You can get them right off the counter. All right, at this point we're going to focus on genetics, and you might remember from the lessons that we talked about these different letters and how they stand for different genes. And each one of these letters is what we call an allele. So these each are a gene that you would get from one of your parents. So one of them is from your mom, the other one is from your dad. Okay, and we're not going to go into a lot of depth into as far as how genetics works again, but I want you to remember that these genes with the capital letters are called dominant genes. The ones with the small letters are called recessive genes. We'll look at what those words dominant and recessive mean in just a sec. Now sometimes you might get one capital letter or one of these types of genes from one parent and one gene with a small letter from the other parent. This is what we call a hybrid. When we have two different genes, we call that person a hybrid for a certain trait. Okay, so let's look a little bit further at what hybrids and purebreds are. So here's an example of how a genetic cross works. First of all, capital T here would stand for the tall trait, and small t would stand for the small trait. Okay, so for instance, if we're looking at trees, we're looking at the tall trait being dominant over the small trait. Now, a tree that would have these genes would be a purebred. Okay, so from one of the parents, they're getting both capital T, so tall genes, and they're getting the same from the other parent. So this is a purebred tree because it's going to get two capital T's. Okay, so you can see that all the kids are going to have two capital T's because the only thing you can get when you cross these two parents is capital T's. You can't get any small t's. So because of that, all the kids are going to be purebred because they've got both capital T's, and they're all going to be tall. Well, this is an example of another purebred because all the parents, both parents I should say, have small genes, and so because of that, all the kids are going to have two small t's, and so the kids are going to be purebred as well. So again, purebred is when you have both genes the same, and they're all going to be small. So all these trees are going to be small. Okay, so again, both these are an example of purebred, whether it's two small t's or two large t's, but in this case they have the dominant trait, the capital T, and in this case they have the recessive trait, which is a small t. Okay, now how do you get hybrids instead of purebreds? Well, if you cross one parent that is two capital T's with another parent that is two small t's, the kids are going to be one small t and one large t, so the kids are called hybrids for this trait. But if you have one of these kids here with a capital T and a small t, they're still going to be tall, even though they've got the small t, because capital T is dominant over small t. In other words, tall is dominant over small. Okay. So I think we just got a few more pages, and we'll be done. In fact, I think this might be our last page. Not quite. Okay. So we looked before at pedigrees, and what are pedigrees? Those are charts that are often used to help us figure out someone's genes. When we talked in the lesson, we talked about genes being genotype. And what's the difference between a genotype and a phenotype? Phenotype is just the way the genes affect the person. So if the person's tall or if the person has blue eyes, that's the phenotype. Whereas the genotype would be, like before when we looked at the trees and they have big T, small t, that would be a person's genotype. Okay, so again, the genotype is the genes, the actual genes they have, and the phenotype is how does it affect them. What kind of traits do they have? Okay, so by analyzing the genotype of a couple, we can determine the chances the pair producing the offspring will have a specific disease. So when we're talking again about a pedigree chart, think about a family tree. Okay, so this would be a family tree. The X's stand for male, circles stand for female, and anyone who's got a shaded shape is going to be affected by whatever trait. So if you're looking at a certain disease, these guys here that are shaded have the disease. Okay, so a pedigree shows the physical expression. So again, it shows whether you have the disease or not. It doesn't show the genotype. It doesn't show what the actual genes are. But we can figure out what the genotype is by analyzing this pedigree. Okay, so by looking at whether males are getting certain disease or females or whatever, we can figure out what the genes of the parents were. So that's the purpose of the pedigree chart. Find out what the genes were. Okay, let's look at some more questions here. First one, what's the difference between over-the-counter medication and antibiotics? So it looks like for this page here I was actually giving you the answers right away. So the main difference would be that over-the-counter medication, you need a prescription from a doctor, whereas with antibiotics, with antibiotics you need a prescription from a doctor, whereas with over-the-counter medication you don't. So that's the main difference. Next question, define each of the following: dominant genes and recessive genes. Okay, so dominant genes, like the name suggests, are dominant over recessive genes. So if a tree had big T, small t genes, the actual trait that it would be tall. Okay? And so for the next question, define each of the following: a purebred and a hybrid. A purebred has the same traits as its parents. And so, for an example, if you're talking about a purebred Labrador Retriever, a purebred has both genes the same. Okay, so big T was a purebred, and someone who has two small t's is also a purebred. A hybrid has a mix of genes. So if you have big T, little t genes, that tree would be a hybrid. Okay, what does a pedigree chart show and what is it used for? A pedigree chart shows the phenotype or the traits of all members of a family. It is like a family tree. It can be used to figure out the genes or genotype of members of the tree. Alright, so guys, we are done, and so I just want to encourage you once again to watch the whiteboarding session really carefully. And what I would encourage you to do is to use the whiteboard session together with the PDF file. What I would do is, first of all, watch the whiteboard session, practice the questions on your own, then listen to the answers. Then what I would do is, after I watch the session, I would trial the questions again, all these blue questions on the PDF file, see how many I can get, and then any that I can't get, I would go back to that section in the whiteboard session, review that session until I could figure out how to get those questions. And then I would keep doing that over and over again until I could get all the questions on the PDF file by myself without needing the recording at all. So again, reminder guys, the next test is next Wednesday, May 26th. Please write it on that date, because again, remember we have preparation for the final exam coming up soon. So just wanted to encourage you guys to continue to work hard. Just a few more weeks to go, and then we got the final exams, and then it's summertime. So keep working hard. God bless, and have an awesome day.